As the first game from Slightly Mad Studios since joining Codemasters, Project Cars 3 represents a real turning point. It's a total revolution, a top-to-bottom reworking of everything the series once stood for. This is a game that focuses on the fun of driving first, pushing the same Slightly Mad engine with a huge sandbox of cars and tracks to more arcade-style thrills. A new career mode funnels you towards the highlights, to supercar races across the canyons, to night street racing that rewards you for making a perfect overtake. Challenges and events drive your progression, and frankly, it gives the series a much needed sense of direction. And yet, all of this has moved the target somewhat for console performance. Has Project Cars 3's new focus had a positive impact on Xbox One and PS4 frame rates and visuals, or have they taken a hit in the process? Let's find out. Firstly, it's no surprise this started with the name Project Cars Revolution. Taking influence from the likes of Project Gotham Racing or Codemasters' own Grid series, it's fair to say it's unrecognisable as a Project Cars game at times. Sure, the fundamentals stay in place. We keep awesome features like dynamic weather, rolling time of day, the suite of vehicles, and the same physics engine powering it as the first two games. As a sandbox experience, you can still set the game up in custom races however you please. The real fun now though is in the events. Every career race comes with a set of challenges, Tony Hawk style, that needs to be completed. From perfect corners to overtakes to top finishes, you need to clear just enough to unlock the next race. It's far more engaging, replacing the dry, pure sim approach for a bit more flavour. Does it pay off? For my money, yes. It's a divisive move for anyone who valued the series' sim aspects, but for sure helps open the series out to a new crowd. Perhaps the biggest inroad there is in its vastly improved controller support. Out of the box, Slightly Mad has absolutely nailed its controls. From default sensitivity to the dead zones, handling feels great this time. I can't stress this enough, it's such an upgrade over Project Cars 2. In its translating a small push of the analog stick to screen movement, every car is far more engaging to actually drive with a controller. Between this, the revamped menus, and the new career mode, Slightly Mad Studios has been very busy over the last 3 years, and it does pay off. So how do the consoles compare? As ever, we're dealing with Slightly Mad Studios' own tech, the Madness engine, rather than the ego engine behind Codemasters' own work. As such, you do get some familiar results as the last two games, almost a direct lift in some places. Dynamic resolutions, full screen tearing are both factors in console performance sadly, but on the whole, the tech scales very evenly between console platforms. Check this out, a side-by-side between Xbox One S and X, for example, shows it's more or less just the image quality that gets boosted with a more powerful machine. Textures, shadows, and vehicle detail are identical. You do get better ambient occlusion on X and slightly boosted draw distances, but on the whole, it's the sharper image that stands out most between the two. The numbers then. Starting with Xbox One S on left, the game targets 1080p, but it's very much dynamic and typically under that. The lowest figure on record, with rainy weather and a full starting grid in view, is 1152 by 648. But the numbers are typically in between. No question, the base machine is by far the blurriest image of the bunch, especially next to X's 4K support on right. Speaking of which, the actual peak resolution for Xbox One X is 2880 by 1620, much like the last game. Expect drops to 2496 by 1404 in the worst case, but on the whole it looks really solid. Again, there's not much to divide the two otherwise. One aside here, both Xbox One X and PS4 Pro have an extra toggle for resolution and frame rate. It's missing on the base consoles, in other words. By default, you have the resolution mode enabled, which, as I'll cover in a moment, does struggle to hold 60 FPS in big races. The frame rate mode meanwhile keeps graphics settings the same, but makes that dynamic resolution more aggressive where it needs to be to try and keep 60 FPS in place. In my experience, Xbox One X still bottoms out at 1404p on tracks like the Azure Coast, with 20 cars in view and heavy rain, regardless of mode, but it does give the renderer some wiggle room. Again, more on this a little later. PlayStation consoles next. Base PS4 here runs with a 1080p target as you'd expect, except the lowest figure is 1344 by 756. Most typically I've seen the game hit 972p in most races, so it's at least a boost on the Xbox One setup there. Ps4 Pro goes one further with a 1440p max target, though again this one can see huge drops down to 1080p as the lowest number. It's much like Project Cars 2 then, and again its framerate mode seems to push pixel counts to the lower end of that range. The usual figure for Pro is 1152p for most career races. That's the numbers out of the way. Honestly, the divide between these consoles comes down to the pixel counts, with a few flourishes in ambient occlusion shading and draw distances on Pro and X. It can look blurry on the base consoles, especially base Xbox One. Even backed by temporal anti-aliasing and motion blur, you can almost see the resolution drop to those low figures in real time. There's no way to redeem that really. It's great that there is a dynamic res setup to adapt for all Project Cars options. The problem is, it only alleviates the strain on the GPU side. It gives flexibility for when there's too much alpha on screen for water splashing beneath tyres, but doesn't adapt for CPU load. Supposing you max out the AI cars on a starting grid, we're still beholden to the limits of low clock Jaguar CPU cores on PS4 and Xbox One. As far as frame rates go, that causes a real problem hitting 60fps. A big part of the issue here is no console can play the career mode without seeing long drops under 60fps. And tearing too, lots of it. From the first tutorial race in the Monument Canyon to the first Shanghai night race, you see tearing run up and down the screen. Such a shame it is too, because it dulls the impact this moment should really have as an opener. Xbox One struggles hugely in the Canyon for example. Drops under 50fps are a constant until you break far away from the pack, and, well, even then. If we move to Xbox One X in its resolution mode anyway, it smooths the whole thing out to 60fps at least. There are a few drops later on, but it's broadly an improvement. And yet, if we track forward to the Shanghai race on X, we're still back to seeing huge drops into the mid 40fps region. Again, lots of tearing as well. So how does the framerate mode on Xbox One X or PS4 Pro help matters? I went to the Azure coast to test it out, a moderate 20 cars on screen, rain, but nothing too excessive. The turnout on the resolution mode anyway isn't great on X, being 50 to 60fps. Swap it to the framerate mode though, and the boost on average is by 3 or 4 fps. It's better, certainly, and keeps parts of the track at the peak 60Hz number, but obviously it's not quite what we wanted. This plays out across the career mode too. Any race with a complex track and lots of vehicles in front will struggle regardless of mode. That accounts for the Xbox machines, but the PS4 consoles have much the same issues. It's worth stressing that hot lap events with just one car on screen and less demanding circuits in general hold to 60, but it's not a constant. Looking at the stress points, the Canyon circuit and the Shanghai streets, base PS4 again runs between 45 and 60fps, slightly worse than the base Xbox One. There's no extra framerate mode to move to here, and this is just what we get out of the box. Likewise, that Azure Coast race really hammers the game on base PS4. For the best performance, it's got to be the Xbox One X version. Testing out PS4 Pro by comparison, we're seeing the Canyon route drop much harder under 62. An improvement on the base machines, but still not quite enough. Project Cars 3 is the overhaul the series needed. Its controls get a much needed revamp, and the career mode, well, it's been a blast to play. The partnership between Slightly Mad Studios and Codemasters gives us the most immediately enjoyable game in the series despite sacrificing the sim focus. And yet, despite the reframing of what a Project Cars game is, there's no escaping the core technology and the limits of the consoles it targets. We're still very much looking at hardware that struggles to meet the demands of a monstrous racing engine, and that's really a shame. The game design has seen a revolutionary shakeup, but as far as its underlying tech goes, in targeting 60fps we're still waiting for the next step. I had a lot of fun with this one, and it's definitely one to revisit once we have back compat on next gen. But for today, that about rounds up everything on the console front. If you did find this quick look useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell to get notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me or the team directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.
That was awesome. Good to see you out there having fun.